The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor, as James Mitchell revved his motorcycle engine one last time before heading to work. At 28, he was a skilled mechanic who lived for the weekend rides through the English countryside. His bright red Yamaha was his pride and joy, polished to perfection and maintained with the same care he gave to the luxury cars in his garage. James had grown up in a small town outside London, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. His parents had always taught him to respect authority and follow the rules. But James had a rebellious streak that showed itself in small ways. He wore his leather jacket with pride, kept his hair just a bit longer than fashionable, and sometimes pushed the speed limit on empty country roads. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. James grabbed his helmet from the kitchen counter, kissed his girlfriend Sarah goodbye, and promised he would be home early for dinner. Sarah worked as a nurse at the local hospital and often worried about James riding his motorcycle through London traffic. She had asked him many times to consider taking the train instead, but James loved the freedom his bike gave him. As he rode through the busy streets, James felt the familiar thrill of weaving through traffic. He was an experienced rider who had never had a serious accident, though he had received a few speeding tickets over the years. His route to work took him past several famous landmarks, including Buckingham Palace, but he rarely paid them much attention. Today, however, something was different. The streets around the palace seemed more crowded than usual. Police barriers had been set up along several roads, and James could see crowds gathering in the distance. He remembered reading something in the newspaper about a royal event, but he had not paid much attention to the details. Royal ceremonies were common in London, and most locals had learned to navigate around them without much trouble. As James approached a familiar intersection near St. James's Park, he noticed that his usual route was blocked by temporary barriers. A police officer was directing traffic away from the area, forcing vehicles to take a longer route around the ceremonial preparations. James felt a flash of irritation as he realized this would make him late for work. He decided to take a shortcut through a side street that he knew well. It was a narrow road that connected two main thoroughfares, and James had used it many times before when traffic was heavy. He accelerated slightly, eager to make up for lost time, and turned into the quiet street lined with old Georgian buildings. What James did not realize was that this particular street had been designated as part of the extended security zone for the day's royal event. The area was supposed to be cleared of civilian traffic, but somehow the barriers at this entrance had not yet been properly positioned. James rode confidently down the street, unaware that he was entering a restricted area. As he rounded a gentle curve, James suddenly found himself face to face with something he had never expected to see. Standing in perfect formation across the width of the street were 6 members of the Royal Guard, resplendent in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. They were clearly preparing for some kind of ceremonial procession, and James had unknowingly ridden directly into their path. The lead guardsman, a tall man with decades of military experience, saw the motorcycle approaching and immediately raised his hand in a stop signal, but James was traveling too fast to stop safely on the narrow cobblestone street. In a split-second decision that would change his life forever, he swerved hard to the right, hoping to pass around the formation without causing any disruption. The maneuver might have worked on a wider street with better traction, but the old cobblestones were slippery from morning dew. James felt his rear wheel slide out from under him as he leaned into the turn. Time seemed to slow down as he realized he was going to crash. His motorcycle skidded sideways across the stones, heading directly toward the line of guardsmen who were now scrambling to get out of the way. The crash happened in seconds, but felt like minutes. James and his motorcycle slid across the cobblestones in a shower of sparks and the screech of metal on stone. The guardsmen dove in different directions, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos. James felt his bike clip something soft before coming to a jarring stop against a stone wall at the side of the street. When the dust and confusion settled, James found himself lying on the ground next to his damaged motorcycle, surrounded by the scattered members of the Royal Guard. His leather jacket was torn, his helmet cracked, and his pride was completely shattered. But as he looked around at the scene he had created, he realized that his problems were just beginning. James struggled to his feet, his legs shaking from adrenaline and shock. The silence that followed the crash was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and his own heavy breathing. As he removed his cracked helmet, he could see the full extent of what had happened, and his heart sank into his stomach. One of the royal guards, a young man who could not have been much older than James himself, was sitting on the ground examining a large tear in his pristine red tunic. The fabric was ripped from the shoulder down to the chest, revealing the white shirt underneath. The guard's bearskin hat had fallen off and rolled several feet away, and there was a look of complete disbelief on his face. The other guardsmen were quickly reforming their ranks, their training taking over despite the chaos. The senior guard, a weathered sergeant with multiple service ribbons on his uniform, approached James with a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger. His own uniform had been splattered with mud from diving out of the way, and his usually immaculate appearance was now disheveled. "Are you injured, son?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in military service. Despite his obvious anger at the situation, his first concern was for James's well-being. This was a man who had served his country with honor and understood the importance of doing the right thing, even in difficult circumstances. James shook his head, though he could feel bruises forming on his arms and legs where he had hit the ground. "I think I'm okay," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were there. I was just trying to get to work, and the roads were blocked, and I thought this was clear, and—" "Stop talking," the sergeant said firmly but not unkindly. "We need to assess the situation and get medical attention for anyone who needs it." He turned to the injured guardsman who was still examining his torn uniform. "Private Morrison, how are you feeling? Any pain or injury?" Private Morrison stood up carefully, testing his arms and legs for any signs of damage. "I think I'm all right, Sergeant. Just startled more than anything. But my uniform—" He gestured helplessly at the large tear in the fabric that had taken months of careful maintenance to keep in perfect condition. The sergeant's expression grew even more serious as he examined the damage. The Royal Guard uniforms were not just clothing. They were symbols of centuries of British military tradition and royal service. Each uniform represented hours of meticulous care and preparation, and they were worn with tremendous pride by the men who had earned the right to serve in this elite unit. "This is a serious matter," the sergeant said, looking directly at James. "Do you understand what you've done here? This isn't just about damaged property. You've disrupted a royal ceremony preparation, endangered the safety of His Majesty's guards, and caused damage to official military equipment." James felt his face growing hot with shame and embarrassment. He had never been in serious trouble with the law before, and the gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. "What happens now?" he asked, dreading the answer. Before the sergeant could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Someone had clearly called the police, and within minutes the narrow street was filled with patrol cars, an ambulance, and what appeared to be several high-ranking military officials. James watched in growing horror as more and more people arrived to deal with the situation he had created. A police inspector approached the group, notebook already in hand. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that suggested she had dealt with many unusual situations in her career. After quickly assessing that no one was seriously injured, she began taking statements from everyone involved. "Right then," she said, looking at James with the kind of expression reserved for people who had created significant problems. "Let's start with you. Name, address, and what exactly you thought you were doing riding a motorcycle through a restricted area during a royal ceremony preparation." As James began to explain his morning and the series of small decisions that had led to this disaster, he could see more officials arriving. There were representatives from the royal household, additional police officers, and even what appeared to be someone from the insurance department. Each new arrival made James realize that this was not going to be resolved quickly or quietly. The damaged motorcycle sat against the wall like evidence of his poor judgment. The red paint was scratched, the mirror was broken, and something was clearly wrong with the engine. But these mechanical problems seemed minor compared to the human consequences of his actions. Private Morrison's torn uniform fluttered in the breeze, a visible reminder of how one moment of carelessness could disrupt something much larger than himself. As the police inspector continued her questions and the crowd of officials grew larger, James began to understand that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. The simple motorcycle ride to work had become something much more complicated, and there would be no easy way to undo what had been done. 3 hours later, James found himself sitting in a small windowless room at the local police station, still wearing his torn leather jacket and nursing a cup of terrible coffee. The initial shock of the accident had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of dread about what would happen next. He had called his employer to explain why he would not be coming to work. Though he had struggled to find words that adequately described his situation, the police inspector, whose name was Detective Chief Inspector Williams, had been thorough in her questioning. James had provided every detail he could remember about his morning, from the moment he left his flat until the crash occurred. He had explained about the blocked roads, his decision to take the shortcut, and his complete lack of knowledge about the royal ceremony preparations. The problem, Mr. Mitchell, DCI Williams explained as she reviewed her notes, is that ignorance of security procedures is not considered a valid excuse when it comes to royal protection matters. The barriers and diversions were in place for a reason, and by ignoring them, you created a serious security breach. James stared at his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "What kind of charges am I looking at?" he asked, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "That depends on several factors," the inspector replied. "The Crown Prosecution Service will need to review the case, but you could be facing charges related to reckless driving, damage to government property, and potentially even charges related to royal protection violations. The fact that you damaged a royal guard's uniform makes this more serious than a simple traffic accident." The mention of the torn uniform brought back the image of Private Morrison sitting on the cobblestones, staring at the rip in his red tunic with a mixture of shock and dismay. James had learned during the questioning that these uniforms were not mass-produced items that could be easily replaced. Each one was carefully fitted and maintained, and some of the components were made using traditional methods that had been passed down for generations. "How much does it cost to replace a Royal Guard uniform?" James asked, though he suspected he did not want to know the answer. DCI Williams consulted her paperwork. According to the preliminary assessment from the royal household, a complete dress uniform for the Royal Guard costs approximately £3,000 to produce and fit properly. However, the bigger concern is not the financial cost but the ceremonial significance and the time required for replacement. James felt his stomach drop. £3,000 was more money than he had in his savings account, and that was just the beginning of his problems. He was beginning to understand that this incident would have consequences that extended far beyond simple property damage. "There's something else you need to know," DCI Williams continued. "The ceremony that was being prepared for today was not just any royal event. It was a rehearsal for the Royal Marines tattoo, a major ceremonial event that takes place annually and requires months of preparation. Your accident has disrupted not just one day's activities, but potentially the entire preparation schedule." The Royal Marines tattoo was something James had heard of but never really understood. It was one of those British traditions that existed at the edge of his awareness, like cricket matches or parliamentary procedures. Now he was learning that it was a significant military and cultural event that drew visitors from around the world and represented an important part of British ceremonial life. Private Morrison was selected to participate in the tattoo based on his exemplary service record and his ability to maintain the highest standards of military bearing, the inspector explained. His participation in the event was considered an honor, and now that honor is in jeopardy because his uniform cannot be properly prepared in time. James realized that his actions had affected not just himself and his damaged motorcycle, but had rippled outward to impact other people's careers, traditions, and months of careful preparation. Private Morrison was probably sitting somewhere else in the building, wondering whether his moment of ceremonial honor had been destroyed by a careless motorcyclist. The door to the interview room opened, and a man in an expensive suit entered. He introduced himself as a representative from the royal household, and his presence immediately made the atmosphere in the room more formal and serious. This was clearly someone who dealt with matters of protocol and tradition at the highest levels of government. "Mr. Mitchell," the official said, sitting down across from James, "I want you to understand the full scope of what has occurred today. The Royal Guard Regiment takes its ceremonial duties very seriously, and any disruption to their preparations is treated as a matter of national significance. However, We also recognize that accidents happen, and we are prepared to work with you to find an appropriate resolution." James looked up hopefully for the first time since the accident. "What kind of resolution?" "That," the official said with a slight smile, "depends entirely on your willingness to take full responsibility for your actions and to participate in making things right. We have a proposition that might benefit everyone involved, but it will require courage and commitment on your part." For the first time in hours, James felt a spark of hope. Whatever they were going to propose, it had to be better than facing criminal charges and financial ruin. He leaned forward, ready to hear what might be his only chance at redemption. The royal household representative, who introduced himself as Mr. Ashworth, opened a leather folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. His manner was businesslike but not unfriendly, and James got the impression that this was a man who was used to solving complicated problems with creative solutions. "Mr. Mitchell," Mr. Ashworth began, "the traditional response to an incident like this would be to pursue full legal action and seek complete financial compensation for all damages and disruptions. However, in this case, we believe there might be a more constructive approach that could benefit everyone involved." James waited nervously, unsure what to expect but hopeful that whatever was coming would be better than the criminal charges and massive financial penalties that had been looming over him. "The Royal Marines tattoo is scheduled to take place in 6 weeks," Mr. Ashworth continued. "It is a spectacular event that showcases British military tradition and ceremonial excellence. This year's theme is service and sacrifice, and we believe your situation presents an unusual opportunity to demonstrate those very values." DCI Williams leaned back in her chair, clearly curious about where this was heading. She had been involved in many unusual cases during her career, but this was shaping up to be something entirely different. "Our proposition is this," Mr. Ashworth said, looking directly at James. "Instead of pursuing criminal charges and financial compensation through the courts, we would like to offer you the opportunity to make amends through service. You would work directly with the Royal Guard Regiment to understand the significance of what was damaged, and you would participate in the preparation for the tattoo itself." James blinked in confusion. "I don't understand. You want me to join the military?" Mr. Ashworth smiled slightly. "Not exactly. What we're proposing is a civilian service program that would allow you to work alongside the Royal Guard for the next 6 weeks, learning about their traditions and contributing to the preparation for the tattoo. In exchange, you would cover the costs of the uniform replacement through your labor rather than direct payment, and the criminal charges would be reduced to a simple traffic violation." The idea was so unexpected that James had trouble processing it at first. Instead of being punished for his accident, he was being offered the chance to become part of the solution. It seemed too good to be true, and he wondered what the catch might be. "There are conditions, of course," Mr. Ashworth continued, as if reading James's thoughts. "You would be required to maintain the same standards of conduct and appearance as the Royal Guard during your service period. You would attend all training sessions, ceremonial preparations, and you would be expected to demonstrate the same level of commitment and respect for tradition as any member of the regiment." James thought about his current job at the garage, his comfortable routine, and his weekend motorcycle rides. This proposition would completely disrupt his normal life for more than a month, but it would also save him from potential financial ruin and criminal prosecution. "What exactly would I be doing during these 6 weeks?" James asked. "You would be assigned to work directly with Private Morrison and his unit," Mr. Ashworth explained. "You would learn about the history and significance of the Royal Guard uniforms, participate in the maintenance and preparation of ceremonial equipment, and assist with various aspects of tattoo preparation. By the end of the 6 weeks, you would have a complete understanding of what your actions damaged, and you would have contributed meaningfully to repairing that damage." DCI Williams interjected. "And if Mr. Mitchell successfully completes this service program, what happens to the legal charges?" "The serious charges would be dropped entirely," Mr. Ashworth confirmed. "He would plead guilty to a minor traffic violation, pay a small fine, and the matter would be considered resolved. However, if he fails to complete the program or fails to meet the required standards, all original charges would be reinstated and pursued to the full extent of the law." James felt his heart racing as he considered the proposition. It was certainly not what he had expected when he woke up that morning, but it represented a chance to turn his mistake into something positive. The alternative was potentially months of legal proceedings, thousands of pounds in fines and compensation, and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. "There's one more aspect to this arrangement that you should understand," Mr. Ashworth added. "At the end of the 6 weeks, you would be invited to participate in the Royal Marines tattoo itself, not as a performer, but as a civilian volunteer who has demonstrated commitment to understanding and respecting British military traditions. It would be an honor that very few people outside the military ever receive." The thought of participating in such a prestigious event was both thrilling and terrifying. James had never been involved in anything remotely ceremonial or traditional, and the idea of standing before thousands of spectators as part of a royal event seemed impossible to imagine. "I need to think about this," James said finally. "Can I have some time to consider the offer and discuss it with my family?" "Of course," Mr. Ashworth replied, closing his folder. "You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision. However, I should point out that this offer is being made only once. If you decline, we will proceed with the traditional legal response, and there will be no opportunity to reconsider." As James was escorted out of the police station, his mind was spinning with possibilities and concerns. The proposition offered him a way out of his immediate problems, but it also represented a complete departure from everything familiar in his life. He would need to have some serious conversations with Sarah and his family before he could make such a life-changing decision. The next morning, James stood outside the gates of Wellington Barracks, dressed in the most formal clothes he owned and carrying a small bag with the items he had been told to bring. After a long night of discussion with Sarah, his parents, and even his employer, he had made his decision. The risk was enormous, but the opportunity was too significant to pass up. Sarah had been initially skeptical about the arrangement, worried that James was getting involved in something beyond his understanding. However, after researching the Royal Marines tattoo and learning about its significance, she had become cautiously supportive. "It's a chance to turn something terrible into something meaningful," she had said. "But you have to take it seriously, James. This isn't just about avoiding punishment. It's about proving that you can rise to meet a real challenge." Private Morrison was waiting for James at the entrance, looking considerably more composed than he had the previous morning. The young guardsman was professionally polite, but James could sense the underlying tension. Morrison's military career had been disrupted by James's carelessness, and earning his respect would clearly not be easy. "Right then," Morrison said briskly, "welcome to your introduction to the Royal Guard. I hope you understand that the next 6 weeks will be unlike anything you've experienced before. We don't do things halfway here, and we don't make allowances for civilians who think military discipline is optional." James nodded seriously, already feeling out of his depth, but determined to prove himself worthy of this second chance. "I understand. I'm here to learn and to make things right." Morrison led James through a series of corridors lined with portraits of distinguished military officers and display cases filled with ceremonial weapons and honors. The history and tradition were overwhelming, and James began to understand just how significant the world was that he had accidentally disrupted. "This is the uniform room," Morrison explained, opening a door to reveal rows of perfectly maintained red tunics, each one hung with military precision and care. "Every uniform you see here represents hours of work and centuries of tradition. The one you damaged took me 3 months to prepare for the tattoo, and now we have 5 weeks to prepare a replacement while also training you to understand what that means." The sight of so many immaculate uniforms was humbling. James could see the meticulous attention to detail in every button, every piece of trim, and every perfectly aligned seam. These were not just clothes. They were works of art that represented the dedication and pride of the men who wore them. "We'll start with the basics," Morrison continued, handing James a thick manual. "History of the Royal Guard, ceremonial procedures, uniform regulations, and protocol requirements. You'll be expected to memorize this material and demonstrate your knowledge through written and practical examinations." The manual was intimidating, filled with detailed drawings, historical dates, and complex procedures that seemed designed for professional soldiers rather than civilian mechanics. James realized that the next few weeks would require the kind of disciplined study he had not attempted since his school days. "Your daily schedule will begin at 6 in the morning with physical training," Morrison explained as they continued the tour. The Royal Guard maintains high standards of fitness, and even civilian participants are expected to meet basic requirements. After PT, you'll have breakfast, followed by uniform maintenance training, ceremonial drill instruction, and historical education. James felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full scope of what he had committed to. This was not going to be a casual volunteer experience. It was going to be an intensive military-style program that would challenge every aspect of his character and abilities. "There's something else you need to understand," Morrison said, stopping in front of a wall covered with photographs from previous Royal Marines tattoos. "This event represents the best of British military tradition. Thousands of people attend, including members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, and military leaders from around the world. If you're going to participate, even as a civilian volunteer, you'll be representing not just yourself but the entire regiment." The photographs showed spectacular displays of military precision, perfectly synchronized marching, elaborate ceremonial formations, and crowds of spectators in formal evening wear. James tried to imagine himself as part of such an event and felt a mixture of excitement and terror. "Are you having second thoughts?" Morrison asked, noticing James's expression. "Honestly, yes," James admitted. "This is completely outside my experience. I'm a motorcycle mechanic who made a stupid mistake. I don't know if I can live up to these standards." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "The fact that you're willing to admit your concerns actually gives me some hope. Overconfidence is dangerous in military settings, but honest self-assessment is the beginning of real improvement. You made a mistake, but you're here to make it right. That counts for something." Over the following days, James threw himself into the program with determination he had never known he possessed. The physical training was brutal for someone who had lived a relatively sedentary lifestyle, but he pushed through the muscle aches and exhaustion. The academic material was challenging, but he studied late into the evening, memorizing historical dates and ceremonial procedures with the same focus he had once applied to motorcycle engines. Most importantly, he began to understand the culture and values that drove the Royal Guard. These men were not just soldiers. They were guardians of centuries of British tradition and national identity. Their precision and dedication were not arbitrary requirements, but expressions of respect for something larger than themselves. As the weeks progressed, James found himself changing in ways he had not expected. His posture improved, his attention to detail became sharper, and his appreciation for discipline and tradition grew stronger. Sarah noticed the changes when he came home each evening, commenting that he seemed more focused and purposeful than she had ever seen him. The evening of the Royal Marines tattoo arrived with perfect weather and an atmosphere of excitement that James could feel throughout London. After 6 weeks of intensive training, study, and personal transformation, he was as ready as he would ever be for the most important event of his life. Standing in the preparation area behind the main arena, wearing a specially designed civilian volunteer uniform that identified him as an official participant, James felt a mixture of pride and nervousness that threatened to overwhelm him. Private Morrison approached, looking resplendent in his perfectly prepared dress uniform. The replacement tunic had been completed just days earlier, and every detail was flawless. The relationship between the two men had evolved dramatically over the past weeks, transforming from mutual wariness to genuine respect and something approaching friendship. "How are you feeling, James?" Morrison asked, using his first name for the first time since they had met. During the training period, it had always been Mr. Mitchell or simply civilian, but tonight felt different. Tonight, James had earned the right to be considered part of the team. Terrified, James admitted with a nervous laugh. 6 weeks ago, I thought the most stressful thing in my life was dealing with difficult customers at the garage. Now I'm about to participate in a royal ceremony in front of thousands of people and members of the royal family. I keep wondering if I'm going to embarrass everyone who believed in me." Morrison smiled and adjusted a small detail on James's uniform. "The fact that you're nervous is actually a good sign. It means you understand the significance of what we're doing here. Overconfident people make mistakes. Nervous people who have prepared properly usually perform well when it matters." Through the weeks of training, James had learned that the Royal Marines tattoo was far more than just a military parade. It was a celebration of British heritage, a demonstration of military excellence, and a tribute to the men and women who had served their country with distinction. Tonight's performance would include traditional ceremonies, musical presentations, and elaborate displays of synchronized marching that had been perfected over months of rehearsal. As a civilian volunteer, James would not be marching with the main formations, but he had been assigned to assist with several important ceremonial elements. His role included helping to coordinate the presentation of colors, assisting with the setup of traditional military displays, and participating in a special segment that honored civilian contributions to military service. It was a position of responsibility that few outsiders ever received. The sound of the crowd gathering in the arena was audible through the walls of the preparation area. James had been told that tonight's audience included diplomats, military leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across Britain and beyond to witness this annual spectacle. The thought of performing in front of such a distinguished gathering would have paralyzed him 6 weeks earlier, but his training had taught him to channel nervousness into focused performance. Places. Everyone, called the event coordinator, a senior military officer whose calm authority had guided the entire preparation process. Tonight we honor tradition, excellence, and service. Remember that every person in that audience is here because they believe in the values we represent. Don't let them down. As James took his position for the opening ceremony, he caught sight of his family in the VIP seating area. Sarah was there, dressed in formal evening wear and looking more proud than nervous. His parents sat beside her, his father looking uncharacteristically emotional at seeing his son participate in such a prestigious event. Even his employer had come, having granted James extended leave to complete his service program and eager to see the results of his employee's unexpected transformation. The ceremony began with the traditional entrance of the Royal Marines Band, their music filling the arena with stirring military melodies that had accompanied British ceremonies for centuries. James felt goosebumps rise on his arms as the first formations entered the arena, with perfect precision, their synchronized movements creating patterns of red and gold that seemed to flow like liquid across the performance area. When his moment came to participate in the presentation of colors, James moved with the confidence and precision that had been drilled into him during weeks of practice. Every step was measured, every gesture was purposeful, and every moment was executed with the respect for tradition that he had come to understand was essential to the Royal Guard's mission. As the evening progressed through its various segments, James found himself no longer nervous but genuinely inspired. The combination of music, ceremony, and military precision created an atmosphere of dignity and patriotism that transcended simple entertainment. This was history being honored, traditions being preserved, and values being celebrated in a way that connected the present to centuries of British heritage. The climax of the evening was the final parade, where all participants marched together in a grand finale that brought the audience to their feet in sustained applause. James, marching alongside men who had dedicated their careers to military service, felt a sense of belonging and accomplishment that he had never experienced before. He had not just avoided punishment for his mistake. He had transformed that mistake into an opportunity for personal growth and meaningful service. As the ceremony concluded and the participants began to file out of the arena, Private Morrison caught up with James and extended his hand in a formal handshake that carried the weight of genuine friendship and mutual respect. "Well done, James," Morrison said simply. "You've proven that a person can rise above their mistakes and become something better. That's a lesson worth learning, and it's been an honor to be part of teaching it to you." James shook his hand firmly, knowing that this experience had changed him in ways that would last long after the applause had faded. The motorcyclist who had crashed into a Royal Guard formation 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a man who understood the value of discipline, tradition, and service to something greater than himself. As he looked out at the dispersing crowd and the satisfied faces of the military professionals around him, James realized that sometimes the worst mistakes can lead to the most important discoveries about who we really are and who we have the potential to become.